So, this is the first test for the Heretical Thoughts podcast, and I'm going to talk about the Cathars. Now, this is an introduction to the Cathars. My intention is to produce a whole series in more and more detail concerning the Cathars. But here's the introduction. This is the basic information about the Cathars. First of all, who were they? Well, the Cathars were a sect, a religious sect, a Christian sect, and they flourished in Europe in the 11th and 12th and 13th centuries. They were regarded as heretical by the Roman Catholic Church, which at that period held a monopoly of religious belief throughout Western Europe. The reasons that they were considered heretical we'll come on to in some detail, but the basic information about them is that they believed not in one divine principle, but in two. One was perfect and one was flawed. We tend to think of them as good and bad, but really it's better to think of them, one of them as perfect and one of them as flawed. And they more or less translate into modern Christianity, or mainstream Christianity, what we'll call normative Christianity, as the good principle is a bit like God, and the flawed principle is a bit like Satan. Now, it's important to realise that the Cathars did not think in terms of God and Satan. They thought in terms of two principles, one perfect, one flawed. These two principles each had a creation. So there wasn't just one creation, there were two creations. The perfect God had made a perfect creation, and the imperfect God had made a severely flawed creation. And these two creations could be contrasted in many, many different ways. But the main things, the things that are going to drive most of the others, are that the perfect creation is timeless. As we know, it's perfect, it's unchanging, there is no passion, no emotion in the perfect creation. It is eternal, and there are lots of other aspects that are very closely related to this. The fact that it's internal, it's unchanging, it's immutable, and it contrasts very strongly with the other creation, the creation of the flawed God, which is exactly the opposite. It's very changeable, it's mutable, things decay. Eventually everything in this creation will pass. There will be a time where you no longer exist, I no longer exist, trees no longer exist, the world no longer exists. Everything is subject to decay. So this gives us a pretty easy way to distinguish the two creations. One of them is perfect, unchangeable. The other one is badly flawed and very changeable. Well, you might wonder why this is so heretical. And that's something that I will come on to later. In fact, once you accept those two principles, there flow from them a whole range, a whole gamut of conclusions that were not acceptable to the Roman Catholic Church. But we'll come back to that. I'll talk very briefly about what happened to the Cathars. And essentially it is this, that they flourished in the 12th century in several areas throughout Europe, but especially the one that's going to interest us is the area that's often called the Languedoc. It corresponds to the region in France, now in France, which is called Occitania. It's a region which has recently been named Occitanie. More or less exactly this region was exactly the region where the Cathars flourished in the 12th century. It was under the rule of the Count of Toulouse, largely, though parts of it were under the rule of the Viscount of Béziers and of Carcassonne. That's the same person. And also the Count of Foix. So 3 important local potentates. It was their lands where Catharism flourished. It grew and grew and grew through the 12th century, so that by 1200 it was perceived as a major threat by the Catholic Church. Why was it a threat? Well, the Catholic Church held a monopoly on religion throughout Western Europe. They held a complete monopoly. They were not prepared to consider, to tolerate any dissent. They hadn't really been faced with large-scale dissent for centuries and centuries and centuries. So this was a bit of a novel phenomenon for them. They started off trying to get rid of it by teaching and preaching. And so they sent a force of crack preachers, professional preachers, from France to the Languedoc to try and convert people. What they thought was that they knew the truth. Anybody who heard the truth would immediately recognize it. It was very simple, it was obvious, and they would be able to expose the errors in this heresy being promulgated by the Cathars. And so it would be a very simple matter to simply convince the population that they'd been misled and they could be brought back onto the true path. What happened came as something as a surprise to them. As I mentioned, these were the Catholic Church's best preachers, the most educated, the most knowledgeable. They could read Latin, they were familiar with the Bible, both the Old and the New Testaments, and they were simply going to use biblical quotations to convince everyone that they were right and the Cathars were wrong. As they imagined, the Cathars were a bunch of illiterate locals who didn't know Latin, who didn't know the scriptures, who hadn't been educated, and who could be easily defeated in argument. These arguments, incidentally, were a bit of a new idea. This was just the time when universities were being founded throughout Europe. And they had very early on hit upon this process of dialectic. If there was a matter to be resolved, you would simply have 2 representatives, one to represent one of 2 positions, and they would argue against each other in front of a panel of experts, or at least neutral observers. And this panel would act as sort of judges, and they would return a verdict saying who had won the argument. And in fact, that's how a lot of religious doctrine, Catholic doctrine, was determined in the Middle Ages. You would get the two sides argue against each other. An independent panel would judge who had the better arguments, and that would become church doctrine. This whole idea was adapted to this situation where it was the Catholic Church arguing against what they considered to be heretics, ignorant country bumpkin heretics. And so what they did was they organised, literally organised, proper notice given, people assembled, an audience, an independent panel agreed by both sides, and they would each argue their case. Now, we only have the accounts of one side of these arguments. There were quite a few of them, spread over 3 or 4 years. We don't have accounts in detail of the arguments, and we don't even have a proper account of the verdicts. And we only have one side, the Catholic side, of what happened. And it is abundantly clear from the Catholic accounts that they consistently lost the arguments. The independent adjudicators came down on the side of the Cathars. The way we know this is that the information we do have is essentially explanations, excuses why the Catholic side lost. The panel were packed, they were bribed, they were subject to duress, they didn't know what they were doing, all sorts of reasons which clearly showed that the Catholic side had lost the argument and were trying to justify why. And this is, I think, pretty much all of the debates where we have any information at all. And actually, where we do have any other information, it tends to support the idea that the Catholic Church would have lost, simply because of the arguments that they put forward. One of which, for example, was they would not tolerate a woman entering into the debate. The Cathars had fielded a noblewoman, Esclamande de Foix, to represent their case, as she was not heard. The other side just would not tolerate listening to a woman on questions of theology. And because of the views of the local population, we can be pretty certain that that would tip the balance immediately against the Catholic Church. But anyway, the upshot is that the preaching and the debating failed. And it didn't just fail, it failed on a mass scale, and it failed very badly. It was a major humiliation for the people who were running the debates and the preaching, which incidentally the whole thing was led by the head of the Cistercian order, a man called Arnaud Amory. So he was an abbot, the abbot of Citeaux. He had no fewer than 12 other abbots. At this period, abbots were enormously powerful individuals, and a whole entourage. They each had a huge entourage of others. We don't know how many bishops, probably very many monks. So it was a huge exercise. But it was a humiliating failure. And so Arnaud, the abbot of Citeaux, he went off to the Pope, and he convinced the Pope that the only solution now was a crusade, a formal crusade by the Catholic Church against fellow Christians, these people we call Cathars, in the Languedoc. In a later podcast, I'll talk a lot more about this crusade and the justification for it. But for the moment, there was a crusade. Arno mobilised the whole of the Cistercian order throughout Europe to raise an army. This, incidentally, was in 1208. He had raised his army by 1209, a huge army, reputedly 500,000 men, although I think we can take that with a pinch of salt, but a huge army nevertheless, who descended from northern Europe down the valley of the Rhine and the Rhone and into the Languedoc, where they besieged a town called Béziers. And this was just the first of many sieges. The crusade took the form mainly of sieges. There were very few open battles. It was essentially a series of sieges, on and off, for 20 years. It lasted for 20 years. And the upshot is that at the end of 20 years, after a lot of toing and froing and apparent failures, the crusade succeeded. The area was controlled now by France. It had previously been independent under the feudal overlordship of the King of Aragon. But now it was controlled by France. Fairly soon it would be annexed to France, and it would in fact start the growth of France as we know it today, the French state. Up until now, France had been a completely different thing, been a very small kingdom centred on Paris, and really didn't extend much further than that. But this was its first major acquisition in a long series of acquisitions. The Cathars, incidentally, one other important thing here is that it's very difficult to launch a crusade against a religious group, because they can just melt away, they can disappear. As the Catholic thought, they might just lie about their beliefs. And so what in practice happened is that the crusade was launched not against the Cathars, it was against the people who ruled the area. And the argument was it had been their responsibility to ensure that heresy did not take root. They had failed in this, and specifically the senior lords, the powerful magnates of the area, which you might remember are the Count of Toulouse, the Viscount of Carcassonne and Béziers, and the Count of Foix. Those three became targets for the Crusaders, and all of their feudal vassals, right down to the serfs. And so this 20 years of warfare was essentially warfare between northern Europeans, mainly French, Germans, Flemings, quite a few others in small numbers, and southern Europeans, that is the local lords, King of Aragon, Catalans, others from what we now think of as southern Europe. Nearly all of them Catholic, on both sides. The Cathars themselves, baptised Cathars, were absolute pacifists. They would not kill, they would not engage in war. And so, ironically, this crusade is a crusade against northern Catholics against southern Catholics. There might have been some Cathar believers in the southern forces, but no baptised Cathars. I don't know of a single one. In the records, I don't think we have a single one. This war, this crusade, took place over 20 years. At the end of those 20 years, the French Catholic forces had essentially won. But Catharism still existed. There were individuals who still believed Cathar teachings. So in order to eradicate them, the word was extirpate, to extirpate the last vestiges of Cathar belief, the Catholic Church founded the Inquisition. Now you might think the Inquisition was founded in Spain, but it wasn't. The medieval Inquisition was founded by the Pope in this area, the Languedoc, in 1331, 1333, in order specifically to eliminate heresy. By this time, the Cistercians had been overtaken as the chief enemies of the Cathars, the chief persecutors, by a new monastic order, a mendicant order called the Dominicans, founded by St. Dominic during that preaching period. They'd actually been founded specifically to preach against the Cathars, but in fact had fared no better than the Cistercians. They too had been embarrassed, and now were essentially without any sort of function. They had existed since 1204. By the end of the 20-year crusade, it was 1229, and that's just before the Dominicans are entrusted with a formal inquisition. In fact, inquisitions had existed a little bit before that, but they weren't formally authorized as inquisitions by the Pope. And so that's where the Inquisition came from. It very soon developed all the techniques that are now familiar to us, and this will be the topic of another talk in much more detail. I'm just going to run forward to what happened eventually. Just like the Crusade was successful, the Inquisition was successful. It did succeed in extirpating Cathar belief in the Languedoc. And the very last Cathars that we know about there are in the early 1300s. In fact, the last one that we know was executed, the last Cathar who was baptized, was executed in 1321. So that's the end of them. Now there's a lot more to say. For example, there are other places in Europe where they weren't extirpated, and there's lots more to say about the Inquisition, because it didn't just pack up and go home after the last Cathar had gone. They found new targets, and we'll talk about those. But for the moment, this is the end of this particular story. The Cathars of the Languedoc disappeared, persecuted first by Crusade and then by the Inquisition. Oh, and incidentally, just to wrap up the loose end there, the Spanish Inquisition was a full over 200 years later. It was initially created by Dominicans, or I should say entrusted to Dominicans, and its procedures and practices were copied item by item from the Inquisition that the Dominicans had previously founded in order to extirpate the Cathars. So that's all I'm going to say for the moment. In subsequent episodes, I'm going to talk a lot more about different aspects. So some of the main ones will be the beliefs of the Cathars, their theology, the course of the crusade, and a lot more detail about the individuals involved, and more detail about the roles of the Cistercians and the Dominicans. Bye for now.